Good morning, everyone. This meeting of the Baltimore City Council Health, Environment, and Technology Committee is now called to order. I am Danielle McCray, 2nd District Councilwoman and also the chair of the committee. In attendance, we have Councilman John Bullock representing the 9th District. We have Councilman Mark Conway representing the 4th District. We have Councilman Ron Dorsey representing the 3rd District. Councilwoman Felicia Porter, representing the 10th District. Councilman James Torrance, representing the 7th District, and Councilman Isaac Yitzi Slifer, representing the 5th District in attendance today. So all members of the committee are present. From the mayor's office, we have Nina Thimilis, and we also have Sophia Gavin Watt, available today. From the council president's office, we have Nikki Thompson here today. And also in attendance, we have Matthew Peters, who is staff to the committee. Before we get started, I'm just laying out the normal ground rules. I'm just asking that you stay muted until you are recognized by the chair, that you do mute yourself when you are not speaking. Before you speak, please identify yourself, the agency or organization that you are with, and also your position. Please speak slowly and clearly. And after you are finished speaking, please mute yourself again until you are recognized by the chair. We do ask that committee members and city officials keep their video on for the duration of the hearing unless there are technical difficulties preventing you from doing so. Last, for members of the public, there will be an opportunity for public testimony. You will have 2 minutes each for testimony if you wish to testify. This morning, the committee is holding a work session. We're reconvening Resolution 21-0039R, Violence Against Women and Overlooked Public Health Crisis. It's for the purpose of inviting the Police Commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department, the Health Commissioner of the Baltimore City Health Department, the Baltimore City State's Attorney, the Director of the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, the Executive Director of the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success, the Sheriff of Baltimore City Sheriff's Office, and just certain community-based organizations to appear before the Baltimore City Council to discuss the rise in violence against women and what strategies are being put in place to reverse this epidemic. The committee held a hearing on the resolution on June 16, 2021, and is reconvening today to hear updates from the agencies on the most recent data and their actions to address the epidemic of violence against women and girls. Committee members will also have the opportunity to ask questions. And again, if there are any members of the public who wish to testify, you will have an opportunity to do so. At this time, we're going to hear from our agency representatives and committee members. I'm just asking that you hold your questions until we have heard from all agencies. We are starting with our police department.
Good morning, Chairwoman McCray. For the record, my name is Michelle Wertzberger. I am the Director of Government Affairs for the Baltimore Police Department. Thank you again for calling this hearing. This is a huge issue for the city and it's very important to the Baltimore Police Department. I am joined today by a number of our representatives. We have Colonel Rich Warley, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Herzog, Lieutenant Tiffany Brown, Victim Advocate Tina Kamara, and Shannon Conway. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Colonel Warley, who's going to provide you with some of those updated statistics, ma'am.
Yes, thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having us on and addressing this issue. This is something that kind of touches me kind of at the heart a little bit from a case, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, a case that I handled when I was an officer who we handled a domestic violence case that ended up with the lady not testifying against her boyfriend. And a week later, I had the unfortunate task of doing to check the well-being at that same house where he had eventually murdered her. So it ended up being a horrible case, and that case sits. I still remember the details from. I can't get into it, but I still remember the details from it, and it sits in my heart with that because I was a young officer. Well, I wasn't young, but I was an officer. Go into the cases. Going into COVID. COVID was a big push because obviously people were staying home, and we saw a big increase in cases in 2020 of domestic violence. And domestic violence has continued to increase in 2021. This year we have 1,499 cases, victims, compared to 1,376 last year. So that's an increase of about 120 victims. There have been 4 domestic violence non-fatal shooting incidents with female victims in 2021. Domestic violence fatalities have increased from 9 to 12 in 2020 compared to 2021. And I'm not sure if that even includes the case from Saturday, because we usually cut off our stats on Saturday, and that case happened Saturday afternoon. But that unfortunate case where I'm sure everybody's familiar with that one. Non-fatal shootings, female victims have increased from 83 in 2020 to 91 in 2021, which is a huge rise, because when I first got on the department, it was rarely ever did you have a female was the victim of a shooting. Now it seems to be we're getting 2 or 3 a week where they're becoming victims. Not all of them are domestic, but at some point I would think that domestic is involved in there somewhere down the line. Maybe that's not the reason for the shooting, but it is an underlying effect in I think a lot of the cases. Women non-fatal homicide shooting suspects have increased from 15 to 22, from 20 to 21. Rapes have decreased. That's a good thing. From 2020 we had 2019, 2021 we have 165. The clearance rates for 2021, we have 23 cases closed and 143 that are open. And a lot of those go from the fact that they refuse to testify eventually towards the end of the investigation. Domestic violence aggravated assaults have decreased in 2021, even though the victims have increased. We went from 897 to 726. And then for 2021, non-domestic violence aggravated assaults have decreased. So we did see a decrease in that. That was one of the biggest things as we moved into 2020 with COVID. We saw a huge rise in domestic violence. We used to have a call every Wednesday with the mayor, and that was one of the first things that we would talk about, was how we could help stop the domestic violence, because people were cooped up in the house and we were getting more and more cases. And then basically I'll stop there. I don't want to know I'm right about the 3-minute mark. So I'll stop there and let someone else move on, or if anybody has any questions, or however you would like me to handle it. My partner, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Herzog, can handle anything that I couldn't answer. And then we also have our lieutenants on to answer questions. Lieutenant Tiffany Brown is on to answer any questions in case we can't answer them. She's the expert. It's her unit. And I've got a great team, so I'll probably kick it to them for most of the specific questions. So thank you again for allowing us to testify. I appreciate your time.
Colonel Warley, you actually didn't have I thank you for providing the stats. You actually didn't have a time limit. This time we were really interested in just getting some updates on the numbers, specifically from the BPD. So if there's anything else that you wanted to add right now before we move to the next agency, feel free to do so.
I don't think so. I think what I added is it shows you the urgency that we need to get ahead of this. And if the numbers didn't, just that one simple case on Saturday, that's just the latest, and probably the one that's in our mind the most, that this gentleman decided he wanted to take out his ex-wife and his ex-girlfriend for no reason really whatsoever, other than his whatever issues he was having. So I think just those numbers, seeing numbers itself, but I think putting a case to it, and putting the case like the one that I mentioned in the beginning, that I still remember like it was yesterday. It was 22 years ago now, that I still remember the house. I still remember where it was at. And I still remember the fire department's look when he told me to come in the house after they did the forced entry. So those things stick in your mind. And unfortunately, putting a number to a victim doesn't do the victim justice, but I think it shows the urgency that we need to get ahead of this and come up with solutions to stop this rising trend in violence towards women.
Thank you, sir. We're going to move on to the health department at this time for any updates since our last hearing back in June.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelly Eastman. I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff at the Baltimore City Health Department, representing the agency today. So we do stand by our report for this last hearing and request favorable report. Just to talk a little bit about some of the work we do around this and resources we offer through our Maternal Child Health Bureau. We do a lot of screening and care coordination. So screening for intimate partner violence is done during and after pregnancy. This is administered by trained nurses and social workers. And then if the screening results are positive, we work with Healthcare Access Maryland and an outreach worker from HCAM, starts a conversation around safety and resources. We often refer them out, particularly to House of Ruth. Through our Office of Youth and Trauma Services, Youth Services and Advocacy Project, we also provide services to victims of violence. These include relocation assistance, employment as well as employment development, tutoring for children, case management for the entire family, transportation assistance, links and connections to mental health services, temporary shelter assistance, connections to landlords, and anything else that the individual would need to assist them. And so that's just an overview of what we do for this, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Eastman. We're going to move on to Monty, the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement.
Good morning, Madam Chairwoman and committee. My name is Nick Wilson. I'm the Associate Director of Policy Planning and Interagency Coordination with the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. Earlier this summer, I believe I gave a pretty kind of thorough overview of our different programs and approaches, and I appreciate the chair sharing some specific questions, specifically around DV-STAT that the committee wanted an update about. I'm very excited. At the last hearing, it was kind of decided that Monzi would definitely be the place where DV-STAT would live, because we are not only are we building up our data team, but we're also trying to expand our victim services team. So this is a great opportunity to really let the data lead some of our new efforts in this field. Couple quick updates. We did announce the last hearing that we got a federal Office of Violence Against Women grant to be able to hire a DV coordinator within Monzi, as well as House of Ruth be able to get a staff member to help administer the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team, the Lethality Assessment Program, as well as money for the Baltimore Police Department, victim advocates, as well as detectives to be able to do more proactive safety planning and follow-up, and provide more wraparound services and help people if they want to leave dangerous situations, be able to do that safely. And with the ultimate goal of not only ensuring safety, but ensuring that perpetrators of domestic violence are being held accountable and that people feel safe testifying, and we can work with our partners at the State's Attorney's Office to be able to hold these offenders accountable, as well as start to change the behavior of repeat offenders. DV-STAT, we did hire a new data manager who will be leading the creation of DV-STAT. Her name is Christina Ayana. I'm very excited about that. She has a strong data background and has done projects with BPD, the Mayor's Office of Performance Innovation before. Right now, I have gone through about 15 hours of training this week and some more next week to be able to access the funds from the Office of Violence Against Women, complete that onboarding and training. We hope to hire somebody in February for that position, and they will be working closely with a new data hire to really start building up the system. But as kind of the news showed before, we can't wait until the spring to really get this going. So I am convening next week our core partners, and part of what we need to do for the DV-STAT is really lay the groundwork for what type of data we're collecting and really get in the weeds on some really questions that have been kind of outstanding for a while. You know, there are statutory definitions of domestic violence. You know, if something happens after 11 months versus 13 months, it might not be counted the same way. So we have to make sure that we're, even if it's not legally domestic violence or intimate partner violence, if it is part of this pattern of, and we want to make sure that we're capturing the data correctly. And so there's going to be a lot of kind of groundwork, but I hope by spring or summer to be able to come back to this committee and share a at least a rudimentary DV stat, but we're starting to collect data as we speak, and working with the statewide fatality review team has been really a great experience before we start our own in Baltimore City. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have later.
Thanks for the update, Nick. We appreciate you. We're going to move on to the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success. Did you have anything to add from your report or any updates that you had since the hearing in June?
Madam Chair, Nina Themlis with the Mayor's Office of Government Relations. Allie Smith is on from the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success, but she's on as an attendee. If she could be either unmuted or elevated.
Okay, we'll get her elevated right now. Thanks, Nina.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Allie Smith. I'm serving as the Interim Chief of Policy and Partnerships in the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success. I don't have any updates, but I am here if there are any questions or concerns that come up related to our agency, or if there's any follow-up needed from us following the hearing.
Okay, thank you, Allie. Thank you, Ms. Smith. We're going to move on to, I don't know if we have anyone from the Sheriff's Office, but just want to double check if we have someone today. And I don't see anyone, so we're going to move on to the State's Attorney's Office. I see two folks present.
Good morning, Chairwoman McCray and members of the committee. My name is Yusuf Ahmad, Director of Legislative Affairs for the City State's Attorney's Office. We remain in support of this resolution and stand by our testimony from this past summer. However, today, joining me is Michelle Lambert, Division Chief for our Special Victims Unit, who I'm going to pass it over to now to better inform the council on some of the internal systems we have in place for domestic violence and what we do as it relates to victims. So I'll pass it over to Michelle now.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Lambert. I'm the Division Chief of the Special Victims Unit. The Special Victims Unit at the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office handles cases involving domestic violence, child abuse, and sex offenses. Specifically with respect to domestic violence, our office has a policy of pro-prosecution. And what that means is we do not drop charges at the request of the victim. It is our policy to go forward on all cases where the evidence displays that a crime has occurred with respect to domestic violence. That means that every prosecutor is trained and expected to employ an evidence-based prosecution model. That simply means we prepare cases as if we will not have the cooperation of the victim, and we utilize any evidence that we have to move forward with the case, including 911 calls, medical records, other witnesses. I can best give you an example. It's probably like prosecuting a homicide case. You don't have the victim, so you use all other evidence to prosecute those cases. And that's the model that we employ for domestic violence cases. So there will be cases that we move forward on where the victim is not cooperative, not present, or at times is testifying for the defendant, unfortunately, because they're still in the cycle of violence and still in a relationship with the defendant. There are times that we cannot move forward with cases because we do not have enough evidence without the victim's cooperation. And there are certain cases where we decide if the victim has been properly served with a subpoena and the case is of a serious nature in terms of facts and or injuries, or that the victim and the defendant have a documented history of domestic violence, that we will employ tactics including issuing a warrant, a material witness warrant, which is otherwise known as a body attachment. And that's simply to secure the attendance of the victim so that we can move forward with the case, bring the victim to court. The victim will be given an opportunity to testify. Hopefully they testify cooperatively, but we do that in cases where we have other evidence, specifically prior tape statements from the victim detailing the incident that we are able to use should the victim not testify in a manner consistent with their prior statement. So in summary, it is our goal to move forward with all domestic violence cases wherever we can and where the evidence supports that there is probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed. And moving forward with cases, though, is not simply about what happens in the courtroom. It involves supporting the victim, making them feel comfortable to even come forward. So from the beginning of our cases, we have a number of staff members who are devoted to support victims. We have victim advocates at district court and at the circuit court level to assist victims. We have social workers who speak with the victim. These staff members go over the victim's concerns about the case, what they would like to see happen, although the state's attorney's office makes the recommendation to the court as what the sentence should be. Victims have rights, and we have to let the court know what the victim would like to see happen. We also speak to them about their safety. Do they wish to be relocated? Are they interested in resources regarding counseling? Anything that can make them feel safer and help them heal, because we understand that criminal prosecution is a small part of addressing the needs of a domestic violence victim, and that they will continue to need our support throughout the case and sometimes after the case is over with respect to counseling and other options. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer further about the practices of the state's attorney's office with respect to these cases. Thank you.
Thank you both. We're going to move on to the city solicitor's office, and I believe Ms. Ruley is here. Did you want us to stand by your report? And for our law department, Ms. Ruley, did you want to just stand by your report?
Yes, Madam Chair, we stand by our report. We have nothing to add. It's still approved for form and legal sufficiency.
Okay, thanks so much for being here today. We're going to move on to questions. So I'm going to open the floor to any committee members who have questions at this time. I just need for you to signal or use the raise hand function if you have any questions. I'm going to go ahead and start, and this is really for, this first question is for Monty. Nick, you briefly spoke on the fatality review committee, how you're working with the state and how we are looking to set up our own. It's something that you mentioned within June, within the June hearing as well. Is there any timeline or how soon we would be starting our own fatality review team?
Yeah, that's a great question. So while we are currently participating in the statewide one, and I want to thank BPD for really helping us follow up on individual cases, it will be the new domestic violence coordinator that will be onboarded in February or March that will be kind of in charge of helping coordinate the fatality review team. So it'll be difficult for us to be able to do all of it takes a lot of behind the scenes work to get all the data from all the different agencies and go through it. So I don't want to overpromise, but I'm hoping that by spring, the meetings will really start to happen in earnest, and then hopefully maybe updates by the summer. But we're going to do a lot of the kind of the legwork of getting the people together, getting the agreements done, and getting into the data first before we can kind of do the fatality review team.
Okay, thank you. This is another follow-up about just goals, plans, and timelines. Can you speak more? You briefly mentioned, and we had a discussion in June about the $750,000 grant. At that time, you were still waiting on hearing if you were going to get it. In October, you did state, hey, we did receive the grant. So can you just provide more information on, you gave us a decent amount earlier in the update, but just a little bit more information about exactly what the funds are used for and what are the timelines for Monty related to how we're spending those funds.
That's great. We're very eager to get started on this. So we have been participating in all of the official VW trainings. To be honest, it's been a lot of financial reporting requirements and budgeting. I really wish that the DV person, it's kind of interesting how we can't hire the person to manage the program until we actually go through all the trainings and requirements, but I'm doing that so we can access the money. But once we have that, the House of Ruth is poised and ready to hire their administrative person, and we'll be able to hire a full-time dedicated person and they'll really be doing a lot of the legwork, I think, on the fatality review team, because they have such strong partnerships already with everyone. So they'll be getting one dedicated person for I think it's 2 years or 3 years. I'll have to check the contract. It's been a while. And then Monzi will be getting one dedicated person for a DV coordinator. We'll be using general fund budget to be able to pay some of the fringe, but we're able to get the base salary out of that grant. And that person will be in charge of the Domestic Violence Coordinating Council, which is one of the 7 subcommittees of the reconstituted Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. And they'll also be working with our data manager on the DV stat, as well as starting to work on the fatality review team. So it's going to be quite a bit of work for them, as well as one of the other projects identified in this grant was House of Ruth and BPD. They already daily share data about lethality assessments. So that way, as soon as something is reported to the police, they can do a risk assessment and to see if additional services are going to be needed to these victims to prevent escalation. And so House of Ruth, the very next day, will go through all of the reports. Since BPD has switched over to a new records management, we are still ironing out the details of sometimes there's oversharing of information that makes it harder for House of Ruth to get through all of it to get the parts they need, and sometimes there's under, but BPD has been very responsive, especially with some of their consultants that are kind of working on this. And so, but once we have a little bit more manpower, we'll be able to really iron out a few of those kinks, but it's still a pretty well-running program, but there's a lot more we can do to have more of a coordinated response all around if someone is identified as higher risk. Mercy Medical Center is one of the partners. We did not provide funding to them in here, but they're still on board to offer counseling, crisis intervention services, safety planning, danger assessment. And actually, we're bringing in Turnaround into the group, because one of the core partners that we were working with to write this grant moved over to Turnaround. And so we don't want to lose that person, so we're going to expand a little bit more at the beginning. But once, it'll probably be January once we're finally able to accept the funds from the federal government, once we've gone through all the required technical assistance training and budgeting. And so then we're very eager to be able to get that money out to the House of Ruth. And we've been already talking to BPD with their budgeting and talks about expanding victim services, which is a different work group that I help lead. Really looking to see the money that's set aside for BPD, what's the best way to harness it, whether it's split evenly between victim service and victim advocates versus more of the proactive uniformed police doing their safety plannings and follow-up and trying to find that right balance. So those are conversations we're currently having with the BPD. And so hopefully we'll kind of be able to get everybody at the table next week to start figuring out a timeline for implementation now that we're further along in the grant process.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Councilman Conway.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to seriously thank you again for bringing this hearing up. As you're fully aware, we held a hearing to talk about DV just last Wednesday, and unfortunately had a very serious DV incident this weekend. It's very, very frustrating to see, especially given the conversations that we just had. So I want to thank you all for showing up today and to talk about this issue. I think this is a very, very important issue, and I want to make sure we're looking at this the right way. Fortunately, I was able to go back into my documents and find an old city stat memo. And I was kind of combing through the stuff that we were looking at DV stat, and Nick, I'm really happy to hear that we're getting DV stat back off the ground. Please let me know how I can help. We had a lot of really, really good data that I'm not sure if we quite know anymore how to get to, because it wasn't easy to get to, but it was really, really insightful. One of the things that we really looked into a lot was DV case dispositions and understanding how many of those cases resulted in a guilty verdict and how many resulted in not guilty, dismissed, acquitted, ABD, and null pros. At the time, this is a memo from 2016, somewhere between 50 and high 60% of those cases were null pros. And so we were wondering, why were so many of these cases not going through? Why were so many being thrown out? We worked with the state's attorney at the time to start looking at the data and start reaching back out to victims to understand the barrier for why many folks weren't coming to court. And about a quarter of the reasons why folks were not coming to court was because they were unaware of the court date. They just didn't know when it was. And then another quarter of the folks were uninterested in testifying and participating with the criminal process. And I think this goes hand in hand with the conversation we just had last Wednesday about generally women who are uncomfortable pressing criminal charges against their significant other for any number of reasons. Maybe they have children with them. Maybe they still have a strong relationship with them. Maybe they're afraid of them. Whatever the case is, they're afraid of moving forward through the criminal process. And so it got me to thinking about the barrier to get some sort of help for these women before it becomes deadly. So I'm all that preface to say, clearly a lot of the problem stems from this 50% of women who either don't show up because they don't know about it, but then two are either afraid, unwilling, but just do not go forward with the process, even though they know about the criminal process in the court date. It begs the question, what services do we provide to women before it moves into a criminal arena? Most of what we discussed today requires that these women press charges and start some official criminal procedure. But what's available for women who maybe don't feel safe but haven't been hit yet, or haven't reached that critical level that would warrant criminal procedure? Can someone answer that question?
I'm happy to start. And first of all, Councilman Conway, I really appreciate you offering your support. I'll follow up with you to maybe say we can talk about that memo. What you're sharing is very much in line, I think, with some of what we've been hearing from a lot of the advocates, which are really trying to hear what's happening on the ground. And so I'll just give a couple examples of things that we've been talking about. These are just things we've been talking about. We haven't made an official position yet until we can really hash it out with different people from the government and from the advocates. But things like the unaware of court date, that's where we're really trying to invest more in folks like House of Ruth and Turnaround. And I was really happy to see that you brought Roar and Lydia Watts, another core partner we have from Monsey, to the hearing last week, to talk about how these people can really help every step of the way, making sure people feel informed and there's transparency. And I feel like they're an important part of the process and how important it is for them to show up. So that's definitely something that we just need to do more constant follow-up. The people that are uninterested in participating in the criminal process, I know that was an issue that came up last time with talk about, putting usually female victims who didn't want to testify, holding them in contempt of court and trying to compel them to participate and testify. And in Monsey, we've been trying to think about better alternatives that doesn't re-victimize those individuals. And so we've been talking to the National Network of Safe Communities at a John Jay College. They've taken their focused deterrence model, which is what we're using for the group violence reduction strategy. And they've actually been able to adapt it for using similar principles for intimate partner violence. And they've had a lot of success in multiple cities with individual, when they do the same type of data analysis we did for group violence, where we noticed that it's a very small number of individuals that are driving disproportionate amount of the violence. You'll see similar statistics with domestic violence, where you'll see different officers responding to different calls about domestic violence assaults, and maybe the victim, doesn't want to arrest because they're in retaliation, as we've seen in the recent tragedy that happened. I've read so many protection orders like, he has a gun, he's said he's going to kill me if I ever leave him or testify, and so there's a lot of concerns there. And so we've noticed that they'll not make an arrest, but maybe they'll come back to the house 5 or 6 or 7 times, but no program, no intervention actually takes place. And so this new strategy, the idea is really start with the data, and it's very intensive. And as you said, DV data, it's very sensitive. It's not always easy to find where it is, and combine it with court data and other data. But it starts with seeing who the repeat offenders are and really communicating directly to them, hey, we're not tolerating domestic violence anymore. That, you know, next time, even if we can't prove, you know, we can't get you on a domestic violence charge, we know that if you're beating your spouse, you're probably drunk driving or getting into bar fights or doing other illegal activities, and we're going to spend extra attention on you until you stop the action that we don't want anymore. So that's another way of kind of more of an enforcement, but the idea is really deterrence to prevent the bad behavior. We're also investing. We actually have an open grant proposal right now on our website, and we've encouraged our partners to apply for a better intervention program. We can do our best to protect women and prosecute, but ultimately, especially for the women that, you know, really don't want the person to be incarcerated, we want the behavior to stop. We need to invest in more programs focused specifically on men that are engaging in this type of abuse. And so there's a lot that we are looking at, that we're hoping to do. But as you said, you know, it is a very kind of difficult issue. But we're really trying to explore all ways to make sure that people feel safe. And we do think these are preventable. And we're going to be looking at the role of guns and other types of firearms, other types of more impulsive acts. But it would, once we get DVStat and get a fatality review kind of up and running more, I would love to bring you in to talk about your previous experience and any kind of guidance you may have as we restart this process.
Thanks, Nick. And I'm more than happy. I'm eager to help out, eager to help to get this off the ground. I think it was a really, really valuable opportunity for folks to have an interchange of problems, ideas, and otherwise with regard to DV that wouldn't just come up in the broader violence conversation across the city. And I think it was Ms. Eastman that was explaining some of the services that we provide: relocation assistance, transportation, mental health services, and otherwise. At what point do we begin to offer those services to women?
Yeah, that's actually a great point, and something that the Department of Justice did an assessment for the Public Safety Partnership, and we had an incredible independent researcher who talked to every kind of most community groups, most many people in the state's attorney's office, many people in the police department, many people in City Hall. And I think one of the biggest gaps and one of the best practices that Baltimore is not currently engaging is a lot of services don't happen until arrest. And that's a big problem because we want the best practices to do right after the incident, right after the shooting or the abuse. We want that person to feel safe and valued, and don't want to lose them, and we don't want the perpetrator or the suspect to kind of talk them out of it. And so it's really important that as soon as it happens, that we start providing those services. And so, State's Attorney's Office does a great job of witness relocation and a lot of those transportation services. They can do first and last month rent and do all these things. But what we're really trying to do is work with our partners to do a time shift. So instead of waiting to arrest, we do the same services, but we move them up until the incident. And we're working with the governor's office. Victim service team has offered a lot of technical assistance and best practices to be able to do this. And so we're exploring funding opportunities that might be available to kind of increase the capacity we have to do this kind of time shift of more services immediately. And we think that will lead to more witness cooperation and testifying. We think that will lead to more case closure, and we think that will lead to more justice for victims. It's not an easy undertaking. It's going to take time. It's going to take looking at staffing, looking at kind of warm handoffs and cooperation. There's conversations about maybe co-locating for a couple of days a week, the BPD and State's Attorney's Office victim service advocates that do a great job, but maybe don't have enough chances to talk about individual cases, confidentiality. So these are all things that we're currently discussing right now.
And if you'll indulge me, one more related question, Madam Chair. One of the things that we dug into a lot in DVStat was the first thing we addressed every meeting was protective orders, and working with both BPD and especially the Sheriff's Office to make sure that we're serving those protective orders in a timely fashion. Realizing that if we're serving those protective orders, we make a very clear statement that this young man or an old man needs to stay away from this young or old woman. I'm really curious on how we're doing there. It was here and there back then, And only with continued focus did we begin to see an improvement. I'm really curious where that is now. I'd love to see that from DV stat as we get that off the ground. But as I think about what that first potential gateway is for services, depending on our capacity, could it be potentially at the protective order level where clearly a woman has stepped forward and said, look, I don't want him around me or my family. At that point, maybe should we consider assistance with housing, assistance with transportation, assistance with her children and otherwise? Could that be a more apt place for services than waiting until she's actually been hit or a gun's been pulled on her or she's been verbally threatened? So maybe sometimes that may be the same point, but sometimes it's not. So that I would love to see that analysis to see our capacity. I don't know if we're fully meeting our capacity today and don't have additional resources, or if we have excess resources and can consider expanding the point at which we begin to provide access to these resources to women that may need it. But that's just a question I think we should really think about.
Madam Chairwoman, BPD has a few things to add. In particular, Chairman Conway had mentioned, how do we intervene before the woman has been hit? And perhaps, intervention can be done when there's a protective order sought. Many times there has to be some sort of activity that mandates that a protective order be granted. A lot of times, unfortunately, then we have already been engaged. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what we do to be proactive and coordinate with other agencies or other organizations. And then also, we're going to have our, so Lieutenant Brown is going to talk a little bit about that. And then our victim advocate, Tina Kamara, who you heard at your hearing last week, is going to talk a little bit about kind of how she provides or seeks to provide wraparound services to the female victims. Lieutenant?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Lieutenant Tiffany Brown. I'm the unit commander for the Family Crimes Unit. One of the things that we've done, actually it's been implemented for the past year, we implemented the DV safety plan. And what it is a resource guide that victims can use. And it gives all kind of good resources as to what they can do if they are victims of domestic violence. It tells who to contact and the court systems, how everything works. We started this in October of last year, and it's been going on for over a year, like I said. Another thing that we've been doing, the districts actually have been engaging the community and actually passing out these forms. The Family Crimes Unit only actually sends this out to domestic violence victims, but we want to try to get ahead of that curve and actually have the patrol officers to do that as well. Another thing that we do that I think is very important to try to mitigate domestic violence, which is, it's really kind of hard to do it, but try to get ahead of the curve, is community engagement. One of the things that the Family Crimes Unit does every year, we actually partner with Sarah's Hope Family Shelter, which is through St. Vincent's de Paul of Baltimore. And that is a shelter that houses over 150 women and children. And we go there. It's a volunteer thing that the unit does. Actually, just not the unit, the entire department. We participate in this, and we do a donation drive. And that's a time that we can engage the community, and it's not an actual crime going on. So it's kind of like a softer approach. So we've been doing this now for many of years, and it shows the children a different side of the police department, and it gives them a way to be able to talk to us when it's not an actual incident going on. So these are just some of the few things that we do. We give many referrals to different agencies, such as the State's Attorney's Office, the Baltimore Child Abuse Center, House of Ruth, Turnaround. These are things we refer victims of domestic violence to these agencies so that they can further assist them, because we have a lot of our victims who are suffering from many things, such as mental illness and things like that. So this is another service that we offer. So I just wanted to add that piece on, because I think that is very important. I think that engagement piece is very important when it comes down to women of domestic violence.
Lieutenant Brown, for that community engagement piece, do we help people understand the different avenues for dealing with these situations? Like, do women do we let women know that they could ask for a protective order without having necessarily having to get hit? How well known is that? Because often, as Director Wertzberger said, BPD's already been called. It's already boiled up to that point, and then we get the protective order. Do we, in our understanding or what we educate folks on, do we let people know that that is an opportunity to begin to separate yourself from that relationship in a way that doesn't necessarily put criminal charges on your partner or otherwise?
Yeah, so this is when our advocate comes into play, because this is a person who is not a law enforcement person. So that's when my advocate, she's on, Tina Kamara, she's on. This is when she comes in and she can really break it down to the victims and talk to them and really give them give that person a step by step as to how to go about the protective order and make them feel comfortable, because that's important too.
And Lieutenant, thanks so much. Ms. Kamara, we're going to come back to you. I have Councilman Dorsey. He's been very patient, and he did have his hand raised. So Councilman Dorsey, if you want to ask your questions now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is an issue that's been of concern to me, and one I've engaged with the police department over, one I've engaged with members of the public over. And my concern starts with the fact that I don't think that we can address problems effectively when our own house isn't in order. And the reality is that nationally, 40% of police officers are domestic abusers of their wives, of their children, of their partners. That's a rate about 15 times the rate of the general population. And that is a deeply entrenched culture within police departments across the country. And I have no reason to believe the Baltimore City Police Department is any different than the rest of the police population in general. I guess as a tangent to what Councilman Conway was talking about a couple minutes ago, is using the point of protective orders as a jumping off place to intervene. My engagement with the police department has, to me, seemed to conclude that that's not something that the police department is willing to do, even when it's their own police officers, their own employees that are engaged in this. Some years ago, police officer Welton Simpson Jr. raped his wife with his service weapon to her head in their own home, and on a separate occasion put his auxiliary service weapon in her hand and told her, one of the two of us is not walking out of this room. So you're going to have to shoot me or you're going to die. And we kept that officer.
Councilman Dorsey, give us a question.
I will, in just a moment. We kept that police officer on the force.
So, excuse me, Councilman Dorsey, this is a resolution hearing, and we want to make sure that we are being very targeted in asking questions. I see where you're going, and I'm not opposed to it, but I really want you to get some questions in or make your point and then get to your question. Thank you, sir.
I guess I'm getting right to my point. We kept this officer on the police department even after a judge had stripped him of his right to possess a weapon for the duration of a protective order. And later that officer committed another offense against a member of the general public. We know that this is a clear sign. Why aren't we willing to use that as cause for dismissal? And what else are we doing to reduce the rate of domestic violence among our own police officers, because within a culture that is permissive, I don't believe that we can service the general public adequately.
Chairwoman, I'm going to take the first stab at that, and then I believe Colonel Warley will jump in as well. I think that the councilman made a couple of really good points. I can't speak to the case that you mentioned. I'm not aware of that, but what I will tell you is there's two different efforts here that are underfoot, actually three. First and foremost is we have, over the last 2 years, really put a number of resources and attention into our health and wellness department. And their goal is to do a variety of things. One, identify trends, see if they can tell if an officer is in trouble, meaning they're acting in a certain way, they are, getting a certain type of misconduct claim. There's chatter around their relationship with the family. They're always taking off on a Monday or a Friday because perhaps they have some sort of substance abuse. Or there's some sense that this officer is having some sort of anger management problem or mental health problem. And so we have a number of different ways that unit is intervening. Sometimes it's very direct. There's an escalating process as well, depending on kind of how many times that particular member comes to their attention. And then, so that's issue number one. Issue number two is through the new police reform effort at the state, there have been a number of changes. And so there is the ability, as of July 1 of 2022, there is the ability to put an officer on leave if he or she has been charged with a domestic violence incident. We have also changed, we've come to an agreement on a new FOP contract that allows for that sort of effort. And more importantly, the commissioner has taken steps both last session and is going to do it again this session to allow the chief to have some discretion when there are certain types of activities, crimes that officers are engaging in that are so egregious that they have got to take immediate action. And so we did put forward that in terms of trying to seek amendments in the police reform package last year. We are going to be working on that with the administration again this session. We feel very strongly about that, but we have to tackle it from a couple of different angles, and we are in the process of doing that right now. Colonel Warley, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just you hit it, Michelle. At the time of the case that the council person is talking about, it wasn't within the power of the commissioner to fire the officer at that point, whether he was innocent, guilty, whatever. And that is changing a little bit through legislation. And also, we are a different department back now than we were then. We're many years and ahead of that with the consent decree and all the reforms that we're doing. Every house has their problems, and we're correcting ours. So I'm not going to belabor it a little bit, but I will tell you, just as an example of how widespread this is, while we were on this call, one of our officers in Baltimore County's wife was arrested for assaulting him with a broomstick. So that tells you how prevalent this domestic violence is in every profession. So we're working to clean up ours, but we're the first line of defense. There's no one else that's going to respond to the call but us. And maybe we can, once we get there, we can help, and we're moving towards that. So I think everybody working together, we'll get this under control, but it's a long, tedious process.
Thank you, Colonel. Yeah, I mean, my concern is that the police is the first line of defense, right? Because in addition to these problems, the culture is such that I've had numerous firsthand accounts from friends who said I was being domestically abused by my partner, and the police's response was to blame me, the victim, and that I felt after the police response, where I felt in fear for my life, that the police were not going to be available to me. And you know, I just know that we have so far to come to where we can actually trust that police officers are going to respond in the way we hope that they will, or expect that they will, or are trained to respond. It's just, so long as the culture remains what it has to be, one of permissiveness, in order for the rates to be what they are among police, it's really hard to place trust in the police as the first line of response. I guess, Michelle, to your response is about what is being done in those cases where some red flag has gone up. Is that enough? I mean, there is no other occupation that has anything like the rate of domestic violence that police officers have. Don't we have an obligation given that circumstance, to be even more proactive, closely monitoring all police officers on a very routine basis, rather than just waiting for red flags to go up?
So let me tackle the first issue that you raised before I lose my train of thought. The first thing you talked about was culture. And as you likely know and your colleagues know, is we have been spending a great deal of energy, time, and intent in changing the culture in the Baltimore Police Department. It starts with the policies, making sure our policies are tight, that it's crystal clear what officers can and cannot do, and what is expected of them. And then there is very crystal clear training that is scenario based and emphasize a victim-centered approach. A trauma-informed victim-centered approach, so that the officers, when they get to that scene, know that certain times victims will act out of the norm in a way that other people may not expect them to act, and that is because of the trauma that they have experienced. Officers haven't known that. This is kind of a new way of looking at this work. And so we have trained all of our officers in that approach so they know the signs to spot. Are we perfect? Absolutely not. But we are absolutely committed to this work and committing to changing this culture. And in terms of your second question, is all of this enough? I have a couple of thoughts on that. So the consent decree requires us to have this constant monitoring, and that is what it is. It is not just willy-nilly. Maybe I'm looking at an officer, or maybe I'm not because he's not my friend, and because he's my friend. We are building a technological solution to this, and we will. It's required in the consent decree, and it's required in the state law as well, per the police reform effort that occurred last year. But on the consent decree level, it is much more sophisticated. The requirements are much more sophisticated. The first step in building that technological approach was getting that new RMS system in place. New Orleans has this already, and there are a number of different databases that will feed into this, and there's a term for it that just went right out of my head, this warning system, essentially, so that
early intervention.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I knew one of my team members would have it. So, and that name is actually even important. So it's an early intervention. It's not waiting until, somewhere down the line when that officer is gone or has done something egregious. But, there are a lot of different types of warning signs that, even early on, you can tell this officer is in trouble, and or this officer shouldn't be on the force. And so, we are excited about bringing that along, and we are pleased with kind of the system that we were able to build out That includes the mental health awareness. It includes, training officers how to do meditation, taking them on hikes if they're interested, to bring down that stress level, help them to learn how to deal with stress in a healthy way, because this profession is incredibly stressful. Our officers see people at their worst every single day. And so they need to they need to learn how in a healthy way to get rid of that. And we are really working on doing that in a couple of different creative ways that we've talked about already.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I could just make a very specific information request, and then I'll step back here. I'd like to know the number and percentage of total officers in the department who are looked into over concerns related to domestic violence and domestic problems. My interest is in seeing how closely that matches up with the national statistics. I mean, if we're only looking at 5 or 10% of the officers as potentially having some domestic violence risk, then we're nowhere near the mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Dorsey, for your thoughtful and relevant questions. For Michelle, can you just make sure that it's furnished to the committee, that request is furnished to the committee, as well as Councilman Dorsey?
Yes,
I want to get back to, I wanted to make sure that Councilman Dorsey had a time to ask his questions, but I want to get back to Ms. Kamar. Ms. Kamar, did you have anything that you wanted to add from what Lieutenant Brown was stating earlier?
Greetings, everyone. Lieutenant Brown pretty much covered everything in what we do here in the Family Crimes Unit. I am the advocate here, and as Ms. Wertzberger stated, we see people at their worst. I am the first non-law enforcement, even though I work with law enforcement, civilian person line of defense for these victims when the incident occurs. So my job is to ensure that they know about the available services. My job is to ensure that they do obtain a protective order should they wish to do so. And my job is, more importantly, offering that mental and emotional support to be able to move through the trauma of this incident and help walk them through the law enforcement process as well as the judicial process. I see so much in my day-to-day, and I think each one of us is doing everything that we can to ensure that the people have what they need to move forward and begin the process of healing. Other than that, I don't have too much to add regarding what we do here, because Lieutenant Brown basically covered it with the safety plans, the help with the protective orders, and just moving forward with relocation. I work very closely with the House of Ruth and Turnaround, and one area of service that we need more of is shelter. The shelters are getting crowded. We get severe cases where the victim should not and does not want to return home until the suspect is in custody. And many times the shelters are full. So we do need more resources in that area. I would like to see that happen.
Thank you, Ms. Kamar, and again, thank you, Lieutenant Brown, as well, for what you shared earlier. So I just want to see if any other committee members have any questions. If you do, I'm giving you a brief opportunity to raise your hand. I see a few videos are off, but you can bring your video back on and place your hand up as well if you have any questions. Okay, and Councilman Dorsey, I'm going to come back to you after I get some of mine off as well. And I don't see anyone else with any questions, so I'm going to get back into my questions. Nick, you spoke about focused deterrence, and it was actually one of my questions. We know that that's typically used around gun violence, and like you said, there are other municipalities who are using this specifically for domestic violence. my first question was, do you believe that it's something that can be implemented in Baltimore? And I believe that what you shared earlier is that it is something that can be done. Right now, I just want to know, how are we, and this may not be necessarily for Monty. One thing that we know is that prevention is what's going to solve this as much as possible. It's going to be prevention. But maybe this is for the state's attorney and the Baltimore Police Department. How are we communicating penalties and policies to offenders? We know that studies have found that deterrence is more effective when offenders and potential offenders know that law enforcement is aggressively pursuing abusers. So how are we communicating the penalties and the policies to offenders?
Well, from the state's attorney's office perspective, first off, we do a number of community outreach measures as well. I personally have done community day in court, specifically focused on domestic violence, explaining domestic violence prosecution, how seriously we take it, the penalties associated with certain crimes. That was hosted a number of years ago at the courthouse and invited the community in. And then we did court in the community, where we went out to a local church, brought in community members to explain domestic violence prosecution. And reaching the community overall is important, because as the state's attorney's office, we cannot directly call up defendants and say, this is what we're doing. We have limited contact with represented defendants. However, the goal is to educate the community overall, because as word spreads, that number one, we don't drop cases just because a victim requested to be done. Hopefully that's getting the word out. You shouldn't even bother trying to intimidate or harass her, which we know still goes on, because it is not the victim's decision whether to move forward with the case. So it's our duty to educate the community overall as to our policies. And then frankly, the education continues in the courtroom, because defendants are often surprised when they come in and they think, oh, the case is going to be dropped because the victim is not here. That is not true. There are many cases that we are able to move forward on without the cooperation of the victim. And that sends a signal again that we do not need her standing here to move forward. We do for certain cases, but other cases we're able to still go forward. And I'd just like to address really quick, someone brought up contempt. That's actually a misstatement. Victims are not held in contempt for failing to appear. Contempt is a punitive measure. Judges do not hold victims in contempt. I think people are perhaps confusing what I briefly spoke on earlier. The state or a defense attorney, anyone can ask for a witness who was properly subpoenaed to court for a material witness warrant to be issued by a judge to have their attendance secured and then brought to court. But it's not, victim, you're in trouble because you failed to appear. It is not a punitive measure. So there's not contempt for victims. However, again, the education is on the front end before cases even start. And I have appeared at many churches, other community gatherings to speak on domestic violence and our policies, and it continues with what we do in the courtroom.
For the police department, do you have anything to add about, because this is education, are you guys communicating penalties and policies to offenders? And if so, how are you doing it?
I can kind of touch on that a little bit. We have and I can't answer for every officer when they go to the scene, but we have a preferred arrest policy with domestic violence cases. Basically, we want someone, because we know that if we don't take someone out of the household when there is domestic violence, then there's most likely it will continue. So 99% of the time, anytime it's domestic violence evident, the officer does a thorough investigation and he makes an arrest. If it's to the point, worst case scenario is if we have cross complainants where they complain that each other assaulted and there are injuries, we get to the point where we may take both because they're a suspect and a victim both, and they both might go to jail. Now, as far as penalties, I don't really think that we get into that because that's really not our field. We do tell them that our arrest policies and domestic violence is taken very seriously. It's taken so seriously, there's a whole courtroom in East Side that's just nothing but domestic violence cases, and it's usually packed, unfortunately. When I was an officer, I never wanted to go there because I worked midnights and I knew I was going to be there all day because there's usually an overcrowded docket. So I think those are the things that we do. And if Lieutenant Brown has anything else to add, but we just explained the policy and our preferred arrest and how seriously we take domestic violence. But the penalty portion is to the state's attorney. They convey that because we really don't have anything over, any control over what the penalty would be.
Yes, sir. This is Lieutenant Brown again. I don't have anything really extra to add. That's basically what it is. I do know also the state offers a lot of different programs for offenders. So if we are interviewing a suspect in reference to a crime, we may give them some information and refer them, but that's about it. A lot of stuff is pretty much done through the state's attorney's office.
And Councilwoman, I can add one more thing additionally that we do regularly. We actually did heavily this year, which was we used our CAD system to identify repeat addresses for domestic violence calls for service. And then what we did is we paired up our family crimes unit with patrol and visited those addresses just simply to make a contact, knock on the door, let the people who live in that house know what resources were actually available. But that kind of also serves kind of very similar to focused deterrence in a way, almost in the form of a custom notification, that it removes that person's anonymity. So if the suspect is still residing in that house, just by us going there and knocking on the door and offering domestic violence resources kind of does take away their anonymity in a sense. So that's something that we did do several times this year. And just one thing I'd like to add as well that we spoke on earlier, and I know this is really a small piece, but every single domestic violence call for service that we go out on, we write a DV report. Every call has a report written on it, and so the victims of those calls, whether even if it's a dispute, we give a copy of that, and on the copy of that contains all of the services that we have available, whether it's shelter and counseling, how to obtain a protective order, resources at the state's attorney's office, resources through family crimes. And that is left with them and explained by the police officer while they're there on the scene, and they leave that copy with them. So that's just one thing additional I wanted to add.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel. So, Nick, as everyone is co-collaborating, you have the state's attorney's office. You guys are working together on other items. The state's attorney's office, Baltimore Police Department, and Muncie are working together. Focused deterrence is something that was highlighted on the federal level as helpful for domestic violence. And I want to make sure that Baltimore City is also implementing a strategy specifically for this around intimate partner violence as well. So just know that's my comment. No question right there. One other thing that I wanted to go to, and this is likely for the SAO, bear with me just a few moments, Ms. Lambert. One question that I did have is when the state's attorney's office is entering plea agreements, what is your process for alerting victims?
So before any plea agreement is made with the defendant, first off, all victims have a right to be notified of the case. They are advised of the court date. In preparation for the case, they are interviewed at length as to the facts of the case and also what they would like to see happen. We advise all victims that the state's attorney's office is not their attorney, meaning we make our own independent recommendation to the court. We're not always in agreement with the victim as to what should happen. There are times that we have very serious cases. Just for example, we could have a shooting case and the victim says, I just want him to get counseling. That's not going to happen. We're going to recommend jail. However, as the victim in the case under the Victims' Rights Act, their opinion or what should occur with the case has to be brought forth to the court. So we let them know whether I agree with you or not, I will always let the court know how you feel. In addition, we contact them prior to any plea being entered or offered to the defendant and let them know after we evaluate all of the information, this is what we think that we should make as a recommendation. We ask them their opinion. They tell us that, we take that into consideration. Sometimes that changes our recommendation. Sometimes it does not, but either way, we communicate with the court. In addition, the majority of domestic violence cases are handled at the district court level because they're misdemeanors. However, defendants have the right to ask for a jury trial for their case to be transferred to circuit court. There is generally a 30-day lapse in between when the defendant appears at district court and when they appear at circuit court. An offer is made at district court, but when it arrives at circuit court, before I convey the same offer, I need to check in with that victim. Because number one, it's now my case. I need to prepare it. It's my own, and I need to speak to them and build rapport with them. But in addition, I want to make sure nothing has changed between the last time they were in court and now this upcoming court date. Has the defendant attempted to reach out to you, harass you, intimidate you? Have any of his surrogates attempted to do so? And have your feelings changed about what you think should occur with the case? So that's all to say, a plea agreement in our office does not occur without speaking to the victim. The only caveat, when victims are not cooperative and refuse to speak to us, obviously, if we're still able to go forward with the case, we don't have their input, but we still let the court know, Your Honor, Miss So-and-so is here. She doesn't wish to participate. She may be here for the defendant. She would like him released. We always do our best because it's our obligation and just what we should do anyway, to let the court know how the victim feels, what they would like to see happen, and that's how we conduct ourselves.
Thank you, Ms. Lambert, for explaining the process. Councilman Dorsey, we're going back to you at this time.
Thank you. I guess I don't really know exactly what the question is. I just want to draw attention to the fact that, you know, again, discussing the kind of the culture of permissiveness that pervades throughout the city. It's worth noting that there are a lot of people who in the transportation environment experience harassment and violence and attempts at violence against them. My wife can't ride her bike anywhere in the city without being whistled at or hollered at, and occasionally facing attempts to have her run off the road as a cyclist by drivers. And I just, as we're talking, and that kind of, I mean, I face that too, you know, drivers being aggressive toward me as a cyclist, but across the board, I hear women reporting adverse experiences, not just as cyclists, but as women waiting just on the bus stop or women being on the bus. And this is a pervasive problem. And I just have to believe that there's a relationship between those experiences and women being victimized at more extreme, you know, to more extreme degrees of violence and other acts. So I guess if anybody is doing any strategic work to address this problem, I'd be interested to hear about it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and thank you for highlighting the ongoing street harassment that women and girls faced within Baltimore. It is a population, if you're just walking to the grocery store, if you're on the bus stop, if you are a cyclist, women face high degrees of street harassment, and I appreciate you, Councilman Dorsey, for actually acknowledging that and just bringing it up. Councilman Conway, did you have any additional questions?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay.
A couple of quick ones, and hopefully it doesn't take too much to answer. For the State's Attorney's Office, I was curious, going back to the line of questioning I had earlier about the reasons why folks don't show up. Have body attachments improved attendance? And then on top of that question, have they improved cooperation? So one is getting folks there, but then what is that showing us by way of cooperation?
So body attachments are employed, frankly, when you first must have non-attendance in order to get a body attachment, which again is a warrant for a material witness. And just for the council's edification, it is not solely utilized in domestic violence cases. It is a tool available in all criminal cases when a subpoena has been issued and properly served upon a witness who is material for the prosecution of the case. That being said, I just want to address a few things. Body attachments are not employed in the vast majority of cases. It is an extreme measure to ask a judge to issue a warrant for a victim or a witness. I would say that at the circuit court level, it is employed maybe in 5 to 10% of cases. We're looking at the most serious cases because you don't want to do this for every single case. These are cases where you have serious crimes being, and all crime is serious, but I'm talking about shootings, stabbings, strangulations, where we're seriously concerned about a loss of life, maybe at a future stage. At the district court level, they are employed as well. Generally, those are cases that maybe the allegations are not as serious as something that you would see at circuit court. However, the parties have a documented history of domestic violence, either by way of conviction or prior cases that resulted in Stetson null process, often due to the non-attendance of the victim in the case. So in terms of the success rate utilizing them, at district court, the success rate, to be frank, is abysmal. And that is because the general practice at district court is for district court judges to issue body attachments that are returnable within 1 to 2 hours of when they are issued. What that means in layman's terms, the police have about 2 hours to find this victim and to bring them to court. And as you can imagine, people are, if you don't want to come to court, a lot of people make sure they're not at places where folks are going to look for them. So they're not home and then they're not brought. However, when the police do locate them, they're brought to court. And often the defendant says, oh, wow, they found her. And then they take a plea. Or they say, let me pray a jury trial and hope she doesn't come back in 30 days. Or that a trial happens right away. And I also want to address, I believe there was testimony last week that victims are held on these body attachments. I have only had 2 victims ever held in custody on a body attachment. One was for a shooting and one was for a serious stabbing. Victims are brought to court. The judges normally give them a stern lecture about their attendance. Either the court trial happens that day or it's postponed and they're given a subpoena for a later date. Success rates at circuit court are much better because when judges issue them, generally they give you multiple days or a couple of weeks to find the victim. Often we do find the victims in those cases. And again, the vast majority of those cases will result in pleas because the whole thing the defendant believed was she's not coming. They're not going to be able to prosecute me. And once they see she's there, then they often take a plea. For those that do not take a plea and then there's a trial, speaking to your question about how does it address cooperation? Well, again, frankly, when you have somebody arrested, they're not happy and they're not looking to cooperate. So the directive is generally, we're not asking for body attachments unless we have a prior tape statement of the victim where she is detailed the incident and we can use that in court. So often we get the question, well, if you have a prior tape statement, why don't you just use that? Why do you have the victim arrested? The rules of evidence require the declarant, the speaker, the person who gave the statement to be present in order for that prior tape statement to be used. So often once they're brought in on the body attachment, no, they're not cooperative, but that's what we anticipate. So we have that prior tape statement ready to go, ready to be used as substantive evidence before the jury when the victim does take the stand. And as I tell the victim, your only job is to tell whatever your personal truth is today. And if it is what we know to be true, that is great. But if it is something contrary to what the evidence suggests, if I have that tape statement, I'm going to play it and the jury is going to have that to consider. And often we are successful on those cases despite the lack of cooperation from the victim. So I hope I've addressed generally how it works, but that's your sum up for body attachments.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful to understand that process. Because as you're fully aware, last week there was a lot of frustration, I think, from the advocates about that practice and what it meant. And I fully didn't understand the full scope of how it was used, what it meant, and what the problems were. But that helps a lot. The other question I had was regarding services to perpetrators of violence. We discussed this in the first hearing in this committee. We discussed it in the first and second hearing of the DV hearing and public safety and government operations. Have we begun making any motions, actions, thoughts on looking at services for perpetrators, whether it's mental health services, anger management, I don't know. Have we begun looking at the front end of services for perpetrators so that they can begin to manage whatever issues they're having in a relationship? Or, I don't know, marriage counseling, relationship, I don't know what it is, but have we begun looking at the earlier stages for perpetrators?
Yes. So from the state's attorney's office perspective, first, I just want to clear up, we would never recommend relationship counseling or anything of that nature for domestic violence cases, because if you understand domestic violence is a pattern of behavior where one partner is using certain abuse, whether it's violence, physical violence, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, to control another partner. Relationship counseling implies that there is an issue between both parties, meaning if she would do certain things better, this would not occur. So that is not appropriate for domestic violence cases, relationship counseling. However, what is appropriate is intervention through certified programs that are used to address domestic violence. And that includes the House of Ruth Gateway Project program. At the state's attorney's office, for cases involving more minor allegations and where the defendant does not have a documented history of domestic violence or other crimes of violence. And after speaking to the victim, we often, this is normally at district court, we may offer the defendant what we call a conditional step. A conditional step means you're agreeing to participate and complete the House of Ruth program or another certified domestic violence counseling program, either have no contact with the victim or no unlawful contact with the victim, which means you must simply obey all laws and not threaten, harass, or abuse the victim. And if you complete that, then we will dismiss your case at the end. And we have seen success stories. We have defendants who do complete those programs and do not come back our way. Now, for more serious cases, either at the district court level or at circuit court, if a defendant should plead guilty or is found guilty after a trial, if any probation is imposed, including sentences where they must serve a jail term up first and then they're released on probation and then they're quote unquote backing up jail time to the judge if they should violate probation, our standard practice is to make a recommendation of domestic violence counseling, normally through the House of Ruth, but there are other agencies that we may utilize. If a defendant has alcohol or substance abuse issue, then we may ask for Harbel, which technically doesn't have domestic violence. They have anger management, but they can address the substance abuse issue. In addition, we may ask if there are issues, sometimes domestic violence and physical child abuse are highly correlated, and you may have charges involving domestic violence and child abuse. I may be asking for counseling related to domestic violence, but also parenting programs and anger programs, and also that the defendant abide by any recommendations of the Department of Social Services. So we don't have a one-stop solution. It's not you roll through and stamp domestic violence through the Gateway program. We're going to look at the allegations. We're going to listen to what the victim has to say and try to provide the appropriate intervention. And sometimes we have cases that seem to be more rooted in, I would say, custody disputes. There's not a documented history of domestic violence between the parties. And if the case is more minor in nature, maybe I'm looking to send you to the Family Tree program so you can participate in parenting through anger. So there are a lot of opportunities, especially for defendants who are not before us for the most serious crimes, to address this issue on they're at the criminal stage, but I say at the front end because you're not here for a more serious crime, and take advantage of the opportunities that are offered to you.
Very, very helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. I would love, given that we know we have programs running, I would love to see the data from those programs and the outcome from those programs captured in DVStat. It's something we did not have before. So I would love to see data understanding how many people are going through the program and how many people either successfully do not have another DV incident in the subsequent years, or folks that fail, and hopefully we can understand why they fail and improve the programs. Last point is more just a point, and it wasn't stated, but it's important to realize in the data, we noticed that there was a spike in DV during the pandemic, during the initial phases of the pandemic as people were home. The interesting thing, though, is that shortly after we saw federal stimulus come out, we saw DV decline, which is why we see a decline in 2021. So we have seen DV go down, but I think there's a lot of talk about whether or not some of the economic pressures are also a significant factor. And despite folks still being in the same household, when you're not stressed about bills, addressing those issues can sometimes alleviate some of the stresses in relationships. So just as a matter of thought, and for folks as a part of this conversation to think about, often folks who are dealing with economic stressors on top of their relationship issues, that can cause things to get worse, but also on the flip side, it can cause things to get better when we begin to address those economic issues. So just wanted to put that out there, and thank you, Madam Chair, again for hosting this. This has been great.
Thank you for your questions, and thank you for highlighting that fact. I want to get to the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success. I have 2 questions for that particular office at this time. One thing that's been key today, it was key the last hearing, it's been key in a lot of the hearings that have been held by the City Council related to violence against women, related to domestic violence, intimate partner violence. Prevention is key in eradicating the epidemic. For the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success, what do your efforts look like in supporting our youth who are dealing with trauma from early exposure to intimate partner violence? Or have you collaborated, and also just have you collaborated with the Baltimore City Public School System on those efforts, on any efforts?
Thank you, Councilwoman. So the 2 questions were around, are we collaborating with city schools on those efforts, and in what ways are we supporting young people dealing with trauma of intimate partner violence?
Exposure, yes.
I would like to find out more information to get back to you about this, but I would like to also note that we're currently collaborating with city schools to be building out a youth stat. And I think this would be an important issue to flag as something to see how we can be incorporating this in the development of that as well.
Can you just furnish us some information to the committee, just regarding any collaborations that you guys may have? I think all of us are interested in maybe this being a component within UStat, anything that you guys are doing. The second question that I would have is just, during the pandemic, your office, the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success, became our go-to agency for family assistance. I know that many of our CAP centers were closed during most of the pandemic, but I do want to know, are our CAP center employees trained to recognize intimate partner violence or domestic violence when folks are coming in for other resources or other assistance? Or are we passing out any materials or any educational materials just proactively to let folks know who are coming in for other resources about this?
Great questions too. I'll find out if they receive training and what that looks like regarding how to recognize it, as well as what educational materials or resources they have available at centers that they may share.
Okay, and that's something that I just want to make sure is highlighted. Our CAP centers do touch a lot of folks when many of these CAP centers are fully open again. I want to make sure that any information that you can possibly pass out or any educational opportunities that we have when people are seeking other resources, maybe that's something that we can do. And I'm very interested in if our CAP center employees are trained in that matter. Were there any other council members with any additional questions at this time? Okay, I don't see any, but I do have one additional question. I'm just going to go back to Monty just before we convene the hearing for today. For Monty, you were granted $50 million in ARPA funds to address our city's violence prevention plan, and $1,412,850 were going to various CBOs, nonprofits for domestic violence prevention, the expansion of the hours and the number of staff that actually support our Baltimore Visitation Center to work with parents and children, and also for support for proactive human trafficking investigations. Outside of turnaround, outside of House of Roof, have you identified any other CBOs that you're going to be granting funds to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate that opportunity. So we definitely, when Monty was given this money, it was definitely a part of our intent and our discussions with the Mayor's Office of Recovery Programs that we didn't want to fall into a trap that often happens where we have great partners that we work with and that we just keep only funding them, which, you know, they're doing great work and we're happy to fund them, but we do need to build the capacity of other nonprofits that can cover the whole city, as well as different, you know, subpopulations and different groups, you know, people like the Latinx population that are sometimes harder for us to get to, or, you know, those organizations focused on, you know, Jewish families. And just what we're doing is we're really hoping to give grants to new organizations maybe we haven't funded in the past. And that's why, although there was some urgency to get money out because IPV did increase a lot during the pandemic, as we talked about. So we did want to make sure that we got money to turn around, who was really the only ones that we thought could maybe do this anti-human trafficking operations. But for domestic violence, we know there's some great groups out there that we are familiar with, or maybe not even familiar with, or other organizations that want to get into this field. And so that's why we set aside a good portion of the money for a competitive grant. And we are training grant readers right now to really dig in and review the proposals when the deadline closes soon. And so we're hoping that we'll be learning about new organizations that are doing this type of work. But I will also say, I gave a little bit of an update to the Public Safety Committee last week, but one thing that Michelle from State's Attorney's Office mentioned was the Family Tree, the visitation center, which actually part of the ARPA money will also go towards supporting the expansion of the visitation center, which right now is only open every other week. And for the next 2.5 years, we're going to be able to add weekend hours, because that's the most sought after time for parents to come in and receive services. And that's an opportunity where we've also added staff to be able to connect individuals to other services and be those folks, and, you know, talking to fathers about the role they play in their children's lives and as a motivation for reducing violent behavior. So we're excited to continue to expand the visitation center, and we've been able to provide in-person services without a single instance of COVID-19 exposure. We've been very careful, and it's really important that we have this expansion because we anticipate a pretty big spike in referrals from both the district and family courts. And so that's definitely one thing we're looking at. But for victim services, we're also looking at, you know, when we talk to Roar, who's doing a lot of our heavy lifting on victim services for gun violence, a big part is making sure that they're connected closely, which, you know, as we learned last week, they are with other domestic violence groups, and that because domestic violence and gun access are such so dependent on each other, really trying to create this ecosystem of care that isn't so siloed of this is a DV, this is human trafficking, this is sexual assault, this is gun violence, and trying to bring them all together.
Thank you, Nick. That's going to conclude the questions from the council members. I don't see any other hands or any acknowledgements at this time. So that's going to conclude our questions at this time. We are going to briefly check in to see if we have any members of the public who wish to testify on the resolution. And Matt, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For anyone who signed in using a computer, if you could please use the raise hand function to let us know if you would like to testify. If you have difficulty finding the raise hand function, you can also use the chat to let me know. And we'll start with anyone who has their hand raised. And then we will go through users who have called in to the hearing. Attendees who called in can't be identified by name, and so we'll unmute each one by one. You'll hear 2 beeps when you're unmuted. And if you wish to testify, please state your name at the beginning of your testimony. And if you do not wish to testify, simply say that you have no testimony. It looks like we do not have any hands raised at this point, and there are no callers. Madam Chair, it does not look like we have any testimony.
Thank you, Matt, at this time. So that concludes public testimony. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. A few of the faces that I see right now is going to be Michelle Wertzberger. I do still see you, Kelly. I just want to acknowledge a few people. Michelle Lambert, for being here as well. We definitely appreciate the information that you provided today. The committee will schedule, and everyone else who joined, we truly appreciate you. The committee is going to schedule additional work sessions where we're going to reconvene on this resolution in the future to get periodic updates from the agencies and continue this important discussion. At this time, this hearing is now in recess. Again, thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, ma'am.